within a paragraph. This is a paragraph. I would like you to rearrange the sentences.
Participants are requested to kindly mute their videos and audios, please.
Right. Take a moment.
Now wait.
Look at the way it begins. Not only did television re-envision our sense of the word, second one begins with every major happening is now.
Now I am posting the YouTube link here.
Hello, sir.
Okay, sir.
Hello,
So
sir.
can you please also post that in the Telegram group?
Anamika,
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible, sir?
yes.
You are audible.
Can I start, sir?
Principal sir, shall we start?
Sure.
So let's start the webinar. Today is the big day to think how far flung we have come and how far we have to go. Along with multifarious struggles and triumphs, there is so much to thrive and so much to show. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished Chief Guest of the Day, Dr. Kushi A.V., Principal Dr. K.M. Francis, Head of the Departments, and all the participants in this webinar. I'm Anamika Srini, and I'll be the host for the day. Before we begin with the session, I request all of you to observe 1 minute silent prayer. Thank you. I'm highly elated to invite the mastermind and convener of this international webinar, Dr. Satiraj A., Head of the Department of History, to deliver the welcome address.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Thank you, Anamika, for introducing me. With great pleasure, I take this opportunity for welcoming presence in this international webinar. First of all, let me speak a few words about Mother Teresa College. Mother Teresa College is a self-financing arts and science college established in 2014 and is run by Zero Malangara Catholic Church, having a golden track record, honored with high recognition and reputation for governing and running Marianas College, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, India. One of the top ranked institutions in the state, which is granted recently with the status of autonomy by the UGC and Government of Kerala. Mother Teresa College is affiliated with the University of Kerala. It offers mathematics, physics, chemistry, economics, English language and literature, Malayalam and mass communication, and BCom in the UG level, and English language and literature in the PG level. Every year, we have top ranks in the university examinations. Regarding the faculty, nearly 30% of our faculty are retired professors who have been working in different colleges in Kerala and outside. The remaining 60% teachers are well qualified and experienced faculty. Now we are preparing for NAC accreditation by 2022. We can visit the details of our college in our website mtc.ac. So this international webinar is in fact a continuation of the series of webinars launched by Mother Teresa College. This is in fact a joint initiative of the Department of English and the Department of History. The selection of the topic for the webinar itself is really fitting for such a joint venture. As you know, historical fictions are based on historical events or characters. Fiction writers add etc. and liberate history from the archive and make it more entertaining. To quote Guy Vanderheide, history tells us what people do. Historical fiction helps us imagine how they felt. But the authenticity and credibility of historical fictions might be on point, but the relevance can't be ignored. I think this webinar focuses on such interesting issues. I'm very happy to welcome the speaker of the day, Dr. He had his graduation from Marianus College, Thiruvananthapuram, and a PG from Institute of English, Kerala University. Holds PhD in English from Kerala University. He had been my colleague in Fatima National College, Kollam, India. Later he resigned for better prospects. Now he is assistant professor of English in Tehran University in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Koshi was nominated for the Pushkar Prize for Poetry USA in 2012 by Kamel Saloon. He was also nominated by Liffey Publications for the Hindu fiction in 2015 for Scream and Other Urban Legends. He was Dozen University's best research academician. He has also won a Harvard certificate in masterpieces in world literature, and NaNoWriMo won both from USA in 2019. His famous books include Poetry for Beginners, Samuel Beckett's The Significant Anthology as co-editor with Veena Prasad and Michelle Barron, an anthologist and co-contributor. Wake Up India, Essays for Our Times with Bina Vishwas and Allusions to Simplicity, that's poetry. His recent releases are The Blue Hours with Deepika K.C. Chance and Wine-Kissed Poems with Jagari Mukherjee, which was an Amazon bestseller at #2. He has more than 20,000 pages for his research papers, and a paper on Mahesh Dattani's Dance Like a Man has more than 10,000 reads. He is editor of Pashi magazine. Dr. Koshi also runs an NPO with his wife, Anna Gabriel, for autism, and he ascribes all his achievements to God's grace. I welcome dear A.V. Koshi to this session on behalf of the Mother Teresa College and the Postgraduate Department of English and Department of History. So now we have Dr. K.M. Francis, our respected principal. He is really the backbone of our college. He has been steering and gearing up this college since 2014. He holds PhD in economics, and he had been the principal of the internationally reputed Marianus College. And it was under his dynamic leadership that Marianus College rose to the status of Center of Excellence and Academic Autonomy. He's very simple, humble, and highly democratic. Thank you, sir, for approving and encouraging us to organize this webinar. With great respect and pleasure, I welcome you, sir, to chair and bless this session. Now, Professor M.T. Joseph, he is the head of the Department of English. He also retired from Marianus College, Thiruvananthapuram. He is really an icon for the students of English literature. He is more a doer, I can say, than a speaker. It is really his dynamic leadership which elevated the departments to the status of a PG department. I welcome you, sir, to this session and kindly motivate us with a few words of felicitation. I welcome Ms. Anamika Srini, Assistant Professor of English, who is comparing this session. I welcome Mrs. Asha Jacob and Miss Neelu Prasida, Assistant Professor. I also welcome Mrs. Sarah Paul, Assistant Professor of English, who will extend a vote of thanks. I welcome the faculty of Mother Teresa College and HODs and the teachers of other institutions are present here. Today, we have participants across the board. You are all so precious to us. Thank you so much for your positive response to our invitation. I welcome all the participants in the webinar in both Zoom and those who are viewing it in YouTube on behalf of Mother Teresa College. I also welcome our dear students who have joined this webinar. I would like to welcome Master Abby John, third semester BA English, who is providing technical support to this program. Once again, I welcome you all in traditional Kerala style Swagadam and Hindi or national language Swagad hai. May Almighty God help us to have a good time. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. I request all the participants to kindly mute their audios. I request Satyaraj sir to please mute the audios of the participants. Thank you. Next, I invite the strongest pillar of our institution, Dr. K.M. Francis, Principal of Mother Teresa College, to deliver the presidential address.
Good morning to all. Respected Chief Guest of the day, Dr. A.V. Kochi, respected heads, M.D. Joseph sir, Satyaraj sir, my dear colleagues, dear participants and my dear students. A very good and
Sir, unmute, sir. Unmute, sir.
can you hear me?
Yes, okay.
So a very good introduction given by Dr. Satyaraj sir in the welcome speech. A big thanks for the same. This is the third international webinar organizing by Mother Teresa College. This webinar is the combined efforts of English departments and the history departments of our college. I take this opportunity to congratulate the Department of English and the Department of History for coordinating this webinar. I'm very happy to say that we are fortunate to get the great genius and the philanthropist Dr. A.V. Kochi, Professor in the University of Arabia as today's chief guest. He was a student of Joseph sir, colleague of Satyaraj sir, and an old student of Marivanius College, Trivandrum. Sir, we are really proud of you. His contribution to higher education is great. In teaching, learning, is a model, and it is respected by all. His scholarly works widely acknowledged. It is hard for us to remember his vast and varied profile, which was given by Satyaraj sir. But the academic value of today's webinar is too much anyway. It is the privilege of the research person to say more about his area of interest, historical fiction, its contemporary relevance, and so on. And I'm sure that today's beautiful presentation will provide much insight to this area of learning. Let it be like that. Coach sir is a man of rare combination. Along with his teaching and learning, he gives too much importance for philanthropic activities. He is a man of unlimited kindness, a good human being, and he found joy in giving. During this pandemic day, comes the importance of our concern, love to others. Really speaking, we people are way behind others in helping. Don't wait for later. On behalf of the college community, I once again welcome our chief guest of the day, Dr. A.V. Koshi. Now I wish to convey all the best to this webinar, and with your permission, I inaugurate this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Next, I invite the luminary of our department, Professor M.T. Joseph, to deliver the felicitation speech.
I hope you can hear.
Yes, sir.
Hello,
Yes, sir. You're audible.
respected principal, Dr. Sathiraj, Dr. Koshi, respected teachers, and dear students. I hope all of you students are keeping fine.
Your face is not
And you are
clearly visible.
enjoying
Your face is
the webinar. This is part of our program of conducting seminars on various topics that we are having today's webinar on the topic relevance of historical fiction, the present time. We have Dr. A.V. Koshi as our guest speaker. Webinar is organized by the combined effort of the Department of History and the Postgraduate Department of English Language and Literature. And we started the PG course earlier. It would have been much useful for the PG students. At the undergraduate level also the topic is relevant, and I hope that our students make good use of the opportunity. I must thank Dr. K. Francis, the principal of the college, for being the major inspiration in organizing it, and Dr. Sathiraj for making all the efforts in its organization. Each one of the teacher of the department has helped in various ways in the organizing of the webinar. I gratefully acknowledge their contribution. My cordial greetings to all the participants. Now let's listen to Dr. Koshi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We are extremely thrilled to have with us today Dr. Koshi A.V. This extraordinary personality does not need any introduction at all. A noble man with a character of great heights, a prophecy of distinctness, and an originator of multifarious ideas. So I kindly request you to start the webinar. So can we begin the session?
hello. Koshi. Hello, Koshi.
Yeah, Sathiraj.
Yeah, over to you. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Sathiraj. Thank you, Francis sir, the principal. Thank you, M.T. Joseph sir, and thank you, Anamika, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for all the good things you said about me. I hope to launch into the topic straight away. I hope that you can hear me clearly and I'm visible and there is no interruption. Thank you for muting all the other mics. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, thank you.
I will make you the host for presentation PPT.
I don't have a PPT. I'm giving a lecture.
Okay, yes, sir.
We have as a topic, the relevance of historical fiction in the contemporary world or times, or in the present time. And usually I start with some definitions because we are dealing, when we come to the present world, 2020, with loaded terms. What do we mean by relevance? What do we mean by history? What is historical? What is fiction? And what do you mean by contemporary world or present time? We need to rethink these terms first. So I wanted to start with a couple of quotations because I have a literature background. So I am going to deal primarily with literature rather than with history. Although, of course, I know quite a lot about history also. So generally, there was this writer called James Joyce, and I think that that's a good place to start with his novel Ulysses. And he said, history, he didn't say it, his character Stephen Dedalus in that novel, who also appears in Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And the name Stephen is, of course, taken from the Bible, the first martyr, a very Irish name. And Daedalus is taken from Greek myth. Daedalus was the father of, he was the father of flight in myth because, he made wings with which the Minotaur was. And Joyce defines history like this in his novel through his character. History, Stephen said, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. I want to repeat that. He said, history, Stephen said, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Now, interestingly enough, this novel was written in 1919 and published in 1920, 100 years back. And why I chose this quotation from this famous novel, extremely famous novel, the novel that is supposed to be totally representative of modernism. Just like Wasteland is totally representative of modernist poetry, or Waiting for Godot is totally representative of modernist drama. Here he says that history is a nightmare. But when we are living in 2020, the question is, reality is the nightmare from which many of us are trying to awake. And history may be a source of renewal or restoration or vitality in such a time for many of us. We find, for example, that when talks started coming on corona, many of the speakers were turning back to history, and they were considering books written in history. Daniel Defoe's The Plague Years and Albert Camus' The Plague. They were taking these novels and other novels, and they were studying them to find out if something like this pandemic had happened before, and also to find out ways and means in which to deal with it, and things that had been learned from the past, so that we could also find out what we should not do. So to invert Joyce, who said history is a nightmare from which Stephen Dedalus was trying to awake, we can think of history beginning to think of it by placing it in the contemporary world as perhaps something that we can learn from, a neutral space from which we can pick and choose things which will help us, and also find out things that warn us as to what we should not do as we face the present and we go into the future. Now here is Isaac Asimov had written a science fiction trilogy called the Foundation Trilogy between 1942 and 1944, and in it he said that if you are a good mathematician you could predict the future, but he used history a lot. But I want to go to some others. There was Voltaire in France, and there was Martin Luther King Jr., and Jane Austen, and Ambrose Bierce, and Henry David Thoreau. You can see that I am quoting people from literature because I want to give you first a grounding into how students of literature look at history, which is different from the way in which historians look at history. I mean, historians think of history as a narration of events which have happened among mankind. To quote John Jacob Anderson, including an account of the rise and fall of nations, other great changes which have affected the political and social condition of the human race. So you have landmark or watershed moments. But in literature, we don't look at it that way. And for example, Voltaire, he says, history is nothing but a pack of tricks we play on the dead. What he means here is that we interpret history the way we like. History is a tale of the victorious and not the tale of the vanquished, often. And so it's a pack of tricks. We remake history in the way we want it to be, rather than try to find out what really happened. And we look at, if we look at, this is a negative way perhaps of looking at history, but let me look at the negative things first and then go on to positive things. Jane Austen, who wrote Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility and Emma and Persuasion, etc. Jane Austen said, history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. I read it a little as a duty, either vexed or weary. Wars and pestilences in every page, the men all so good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome. So this is from North Angeles. As for the pyramids, there is nothing to wonder at in them so much as the fact that so many men could be found degraded enough to spend their lives constructing a tomb for some ambitious person whom it found in the Nile and then from Walden. But Ambrose Bierce, this is really interesting, what Ambrose Bierce says. History, noun. He has a famous book called The Dead, and there he says, history falls of events mostly unimportant, which are brought about by rulers mostly knaves and soldiers mostly fools. Of Roman history, great neighbors shown. It is 9/10 line as a guide, wherein he blundered and how much he lied. It's from the Devil's Dictionary. So the title is given ironically. So whether you want to believe him or not is up to you. But the point that they make is, history talks about peaks and troves, mountaintop experiences and the pits in the valleys, and seems to leave out actual history. We are making history, we are made by history, and most of the time it is a story of ordinary everyday incidents by ordinary people. We also have a definition which I really want to read by Martin Luther King Jr. He says, what are the major lessons of history? There are four. First, whom the gods destroy, they first make mad with power. Second, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small. Third, the bee fertilizes the flower it robs. Fourth, when it is dark enough, you can see the stars. And history, according to Edward Hallett Carr, is a dialogue between the present and past. Okay, so I've given you a lot of definitions, more from the side of literature than from the side of history. If you want to know definitions of history, of course, you go to Arnold Toynbee, and history not used is nothing. For all intellectual life is action, like practical life. And if you don't use the stuff well, you might as well be dead. I don't know whether I can define history. It means inquiry, it means research. It's based on a German word. It means an intelligible and significant narration of past events. And it's something that we take for granted that such and such a thing happened based on written records that don't purport to be fictional and based on anthropological evidence. These are archaeological evidence, which back up, scientifically speaking, what history is about. So history is considered a science because it offers proof, although it comes in humanities. When it says something happened, and it has to offer proof if you want to take something as having happened. Otherwise, we put it as a questionable event. Now I want to make a leap to historical fiction. And I want to start straight away. I'm not going into, I'm going straight away into theory, present day theory, which is to say that after, the arrival of Foucault, after the arrival of Stephen Greenblatt, after the arrival of new historicism, what we need to understand is that historical fiction is a postmodern term. And what that means is you can look at anything as historical and anything as fiction. This is where I want to start. You don't differentiate between literature and what is not literature, and you don't differentiate between history and what is not history, because you find something that you want to take from what is considered not literature also about history, and similarly you may find insights into history in writing which is necessarily not historical. So by breaking down this division, new historicism opens a door for histories, for a story to be looked at from different angles. I remember reading about Walter Raleigh, who wrote, if I remember correctly, a history of England and the world. And in the middle of it, something happened in the street, and he went down and asked everyone what happened. And each person told him a different story. So he found out that he could not really find out what happened, but he had some kind of an outline of what happened. And this changed his approach to the book he was writing about history. This does not mean that nothing happened, but it means that it is based on perception as to how people look at what actually happened. And perceptions vary from person to person. So we come to the importance of historical fiction. We come to the next word. I defined something about history and historical. Now I want to come to fiction. And fiction, why do people write historical fiction instead of writing history? Of course, one answer is that you say that history is boring to read and it's written in a very dry bones fashion. But I think that a more relevant answer is that fiction is a kind of a way of lying that brings us closer to the truth sometimes than just stating the truth as it is, boldly. This is also questionable because, last year in 2019, Oxford English Dictionary said the most important word in the dictionary, the new word, was post-truth. So whether there is something called the truth is itself a questionable matter in terms of theory. So new historicists who are influenced by Foucault and whose major thinker is Stephen Greenblatt, and I have done a course by Stephen Greenblatt from Harvard, not the course you mentioned, but another one about unlocking Shakespeare. And writers like this, they when they write about history, even though it's not fiction, they bring in the imagination. For example, Stephen Greenblatt has a book called Will in His World about William Shakespeare, and he says, I am trying to recreate the life of William Shakespeare. And he says, he openly admits, I use my imagination to do it. But he feels that by using it, he may come closer to the life of William Shakespeare as it actually was than by not using it. So in a way, he has taken away the distinction between a kind of book about a historical figure and fiction. We don't know whether his book is partly fictional. And it is partly fictional. He just takes away the curtain. He removes the idea that a writer always writes only by using facts and things like that. So now let us come to historical fiction. And so just like thinkers like Stephen Greenblatt help me to overturn the tables, to use a biblical term, what I want to tell you is what matters about historical fiction, which I am going to define now, is not so much what it says about history, but what it means to us. There's somebody.
Koshi, please unmute it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's of course very good to know about the First World War, the Second World War, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution, the Indian independence struggle. But the real question that we come to, but before that, is what relevance does it have to us today, now, here, in the present, and what good is it going to do us when we make plans for our future? So the shift was made heavily by new historicism, and that's what I want to state briefly about theory. Now I will talk about historical fiction. What is historical fiction? So if you study critics on historical fiction, we notice that they say historical fiction is itself, a mixture of reality and fiction. history and fiction. What should be historical? The setting should be historical. The characters, some of them may be historical and some may be real. And even the historical ones have to be believable. There's a question of relatability. We should be able to relate to them. The writer should have done so much research and it should be well done so that we can relate to the characters to understand that, and that we have to believe that the writer has to make us willingly suspend our disbelief so that we really believe that such a person could have come from that time and that place. So the setting of time and place, please mute your mics, all who are listening, because otherwise, I cannot go on with the talk. You have to mute your mics. You have to do that politeness. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes,
Hello.
sir. You're
Okay.
audible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so, we need to understand that when we speak of historical fiction, the first and most important point is setting. The time, the place, and the space, or the social milieu, the political and economical and psychological, philosophical background of that time. That has to be exact as far as the writer can make it. So the writer has to do a lot of research if he wants to write a historical novel. But there's another way of writing it, which is you write a realistic novel knowing that that realistic novel which you write about the present will be a historical fiction novel for those who come in the future. And someone who was very good at doing this was Charles Dickens. So to look at Charles Dickens's novels, if you look at A Tale of Two Cities, it is historical fiction because it deals with the French Revolution, which happened not in his time, but it happened much earlier in the time of Wordsworth. But if you look at Hard Times, it's a realistic novel. It's written during his time. But when I teach it to my students, how does it look to them? It looks to them like historical fiction. The setting to them comes from the past. It's set in the 19th century. It was published in 1854. It's set in 19th century England. It's set in an imaginary town like Oaktown, which is like Manchester. And it also has a real place, Liverpool, in it towards the end, which is still there in England, but the Liverpool of that time. And so, though I teach it to them as a realistic novel, the real truth is I am teaching it to them also as historical. So setting is there, and then the characters. There will be real characters. In the background of the novel, we have Queen Victoria in a very tangible way, because this Hard Time starts in a school, and the school would not have been there if there had not been a hullabaloo raised over child labor by writers like William Blake in poems like Chimney Sweepers, and by Dickens himself and many other writers, by Dickens in Oliver Twist, by Dickens in David Copperfield. And as a result, Queen Victoria passed a law which she called universal education. And of course, we know that it was not universal education, but the school instead of poor, and teachers were there. So that law made by Queen Victoria and the Parliament, it's very much there in the back of a book like Hard Times. So it's very historical, and many of the references are historical. So the time and place, or the space, or the milieu matters, and the milieu is seen in the dress of the characters, the rich and the poor characters, what they eat, what they drink. in their forms of entertainment, in their culture, and the characters matter. The characters, as I said, may be real or may be believable. And then of course the theme matters. Even the theme will have in it reflections of what were the so-called hotly debated, discussed, or burning topics of the day. And the plot, the story, the point of view, all these things will reflect what the author thinks of that time in his or her own way. One of the points I want to make here is, if you read many of the novels about the French Revolution, for example, you must all have heard of a novel called The Scarlet Pimpernel. It's a very famous novel. Or A Tale of Two Cities. Or if you look at a writer like Marquis de Sade, and another writer is Alexander Dumas, and we speak of historical fiction in France, was very famous in India uh, because of novels like The Three Musketeers, which was used even in a famous film, Slumdog Millionaire. And the final question is based on Three Musketeers. And you see, in all these writers, what we notice is that when they write about their time or about the past, they tend to romanticize or glamorize or glorify the past. And they tend to some extent, I'm not saying that this is completely true, they tend to hide what was actually wrong with those times. For example, someone writing a novel about America, Mark Twain doesn't do that in Huckleberry Finn. He points out that racism existed, and his book is banned in many places because it uses the word, a word I can't say, but Huckleberry Finn calls Jim that word. So some schools ban it, which I don't agree with, because I think that Mark Twain was, a realist and presenting a fact that racism existed in that time, which is something that many people don't want to do. So this is a point I want to come to when I speak of historical fiction. So I told you what historical fiction is, what it does, that there should be reflections of, the history of the time that is being portrayed in the plot, in the story, in the point of view. And the characters definitely should be historical, their clothes, what they eat, the streets they walk through, what they see, their forms of entertainment, their culture, topics they discuss. And most of all, the setting must be true to its time. When we read the setting, we should not feel it's a novel. We should not feel it's fictional. This is what experts say. We should feel that, yeah, this is really how it is or how it was. So in that sense, Ulysses by James Joyce is also historical fiction, because James Joyce made a, claim. He said, he based it on a particular day, which is now called Bloomsday. And he said, if you read my book, Ulysses, that's Wednesday, 16 June of 1904. That's called Bloomsday. He said, if you read my novel, from it you can recreate, if you want, Dublin in another empty part of the world exactly as it was in 1904. It's a very startling claim. But it's a technique that historical fiction is supposed to use. When you say historical fiction and you write about the 19th century, 18th century, when people read it and they read about a street. For example, if I write about Trivandrum, I've written about Trivandrum, a novel which is kept in my locker, And when I rework it, I hope to publish it. But the Trivandrum I'm talking about is not the Trivandrum of today. It's the Trivandrum of my childhood and my youth. And everything has changed. The streets have changed, the shops have changed, the places have changed. But this will explain to you what historical fiction does, that if I ever publish that novel, you will read it, and from it you will be able to recreate parts of Trivandrum as it used to be in the 80s when I was a young lad. That's what historical fiction does in terms of setting. That's what historical fiction does. And same with the characters. So you may have historical characters appearing directly on the stage of the novel, or you may have them lurking in the background, like I told you about Queen Victoria. And you also know about the age by reading the novel, as there will be a lot of talk in it about what is really happening. Now, there's a reason why I'm talking about Hard Times by Charles Dickens and looking at it as a historical novel or historical fiction, though it's not historical fiction, but I'm taking that liberty with the help of new historicism, like I told you. Why I take this novel is because of a very simple reason. It was written at a time when Europe was changing and England was changing. Great Britain, as it was called then, whether it was great or not is debatable, was changing. And the Victorian age lasted for 64 years, and it was the parent of the modern, according to George P. Landor. And in the middle of that change, what this novel does is, it is an amazing novel for me always, which I turn back to again and again, because people say what really happened in the 19th century, and we all know Marxism, Engels, Das Kapital, the Communist Manifesto, it came in. And then also came Sigmund Freud and the interpretation of dreams, and Freud as a father of psychology and psychoanalysis. And along with that came Martin Luther, who said that, everyone has the right to read the Bible, the beginning of the Reformation. And the fourth major figure was Charles Darwin, which is Origin of Species, which made three startling claims. One is that, everything came out of nothing. The second, that life came about by chance. And the third, that man evolved as a result of simple organisms, becoming complex organisms, which we know created, a huge change in the world. So this is a historical background, and this historical background is reflected in this novel Hard Times, which deals with rich and poor people in England, bringing in the question of class. It deals with the suffering of women, bringing in the question of sex and gender. It deals with the suffering of children, bringing in the question of children's rights. It deals with a dog, that brings in the question of animals. It deals with the circus, people who are considered vagabonds, gypsies, vagrants, etc. And that brings in the question of ethnic studies and the issue of minorities, people who, to speak in today's terms, what do you do with somebody who lives on the street, who does not have an Aadhaar card, who does not have a PAN card, who does not have a voter's card, who does not have a ration card, who does not know how to read, write, cannot apply for it. Now the question is he a citizen of India or is he not a citizen of India? And Dickens was already talking about these things, not so specifically. And there's another question that comes in, which is from Giorgio Agamben, who's an Italian philosopher. Some of you may have heard of him, and he speaks about two kinds of human beings that is going to be there in the modern world, which is a world of surveillance, where you're constantly, everyone is watching you, and the state is watching you, the government is watching you. And in the state of surveillance, there are two kinds of people. He says there are people who, and then there are people who are Zoe. That means they are politically of value. They can be considered as being important enough for the state, who are bios, mere life. No one cares what happens to them. In the sense that, such a person can be lynched, no one will ask any questions. Such a person can be imprisoned, no one will ask any questions. Consciousness of the nation is important enough. He has something more than bios. He has Zoe. And there's the idea of the homo, S-A-C-E-R, homo say, which means the sacred man, or interesting. What it means is he's a man who the nation can sacrifice for the sake of the well-being of the nation. He's a scapegoat. He is sacrificed in a Jewish ritual or a Muslim ritual, or like the figure of the crucified Christ. And ordinary citizens are now living in a time of corona where they very clearly understand anything can happen to anyone. But George Orwell said in his political fable, which is also historical fiction in disguise, Animal Farm, he said some people are more equal than others. At the end, where the pigs and the human beings begin to resemble each other more and more, which was written in the background of the Russian Revolution, which was written some people having power and some people being fooled into believing they have power when they don't, the ordinary people. And how all the ideals of an equal society were being watered down, and it was flowing away into nothingness. So in our present case, where historical fiction must address character, dialogue, setting, theme, plot, conflict, and world building. To come back to the approach we need to take to historical fiction when we study historical fiction. Again, I return to Stephen Greenblatt, who some people say is the founder of New Historicism. What do we do when we read historical fiction? We negotiate between the particular and the universal. And what are the tools we used for negotiation? So there is a traditional classicist for example, if we take the example thrown into jail. Debtor's prison for taking the city and living.
Yeah. It's okay. Go ahead.
Is it breaking the voice?
Something.
Yeah. So okay. So Dickens had a kind of grudge against his father. His father did not purposefully hurt him, but hurt him indirectly. So if you look at the word, bad fathers appearing in the books, fathers who can't be trusted, older people who can't be trusted, problems of children. So this is a biographical element. This is a biographical element. Dr. Shambling Vani, can you mute him, please? Thank you.
It's okay. Continue, brother. Koshi, you can.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, now you're audible.
Yeah, I'm finishing very quickly now because we seem to be having some problem with the audio. So the traditional way is not a historical way. You look at the biographical element and you connect it to the text and you say this happens because it is a parallel to what happened in the life of the author, and so that is a particular element, and from there we try to abstract and go on to the universal element. So we negotiate between the particular and the universal. So we say Charles Dickens had a bad father. Bad fathers appear in hard times. Sissy Jupe's father is bad. Tom's and Louisa's father is bad, but later becomes good. And then we say from this we can abstract to the universal that there are bad fathers all over the world, and because of that children suffer all over the world. And Dickens suggests how that can be dealt with, or what will happen if it is not dealt with. And his answer is good education will help children to gain agency and independence, so that even if they have bad parents at home, the education will help them to overcome that handicap, and they can come to a better life. So things like that, which start with the personal, particular, biographical, and go on to the universal. Now the second kind of interpretation is the historical interpretation. What do I mean by historical interpretation? That is to analyze a text in the terms of the time in which it happened. That's what I've been doing so far. For example, in hard times, there's a union. And there's a union leader. Revolutionary ideas, rebellion, revolt, the idea of protest, of strike, the idea of asking for more wages, better terms, all that comes in. Although Dickens doesn't take a stand on it, he's neutral. He's neither for the workers nor for the bosses, and he takes a different position entirely on the matter. But he brings in Freud, because Louisa and Tom, who are brother and sister, their relationship often verges almost on the incestuous. And he brings in Marx, he brings in politics. He shows that it's a time that is moving beyond monarchy into democracy, because everyone wants more and more of equality and equity. He brings in the religious element, because one of the characters, Stephen Blackpool, he is religious, he's a Methodist, but he interprets the Bible for himself. And he brings in the economic element, because very clearly one of the battles in the book is to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And the rich are the new rich, who are making money of colonialism and imperialism, and therefore have gained power, displacing the aristocracy but being unjust to the factory workers. And he tries to address that. So the whole book, and another way of looking at it is textually. The whole book, you can say, we look at it in terms of the history of its time, and we analyze it accordingly. Now, this is what I do with my students at the undergraduate level. But because I am speaking to a huge audience, many of you I know our professors, assistant professors, associate professors, researchers, academicians, I am going to read what Stephen Greenblatt says about presentism. First historicism, and then presentism, and I will close there. A historicist critic is one who seeks to place a text in its context to reveal the embeddedness of, for example, Shakespeare's Macbeth in the witch hunting mania of King James I's early reign. So in Macbeth there are witches, and those witches we don't know whether they are good or bad. But this was because there was a fear of witches in Shakespeare's time in James I during that time. Historicists might use what we know about social customs, economics, politics, or religion to read a text. They might also do primary research in a historical archive, uncovering documents that shed new light on something about the text that a reader at several centuries removed from the text's original publication previously could not see. So, there is an author's problem where we don't know which has more value, the author's intention or the reader's reaction. Similarly, there's a time problem. When we read a historical fiction work, should we lean towards a historicist reading of it, looking at it in the context of its time, or should we look at it in terms of a presentist reading of the text, placing more value on the historical embeddedness we were describing above, or conversely, the modern relevance of a text? So finally, to end, I want to read about a presentist critic, the most important one. What relevance does a historical fiction work have for a student of history or a student of literature? Finally, and he says it has relevance because it has relevance in the here and how we look at it today, how we interpret it, how we apply it to our lives. So, a presentist critic is one who seeks to place a text in a modern context to reveal the relevance, for example, of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew to ongoing conversations about women's rights. When writing about historical fiction or any writer in the past who thereby automatically becomes historical and fictional, presentists might apply a modern theory or idea to the plays to see how they stack up, or they might use the plays or novels or short stories, whatever text you use, as examples to make a point. Yeah, a presentist interpretation thus might reread the play by putting it in one's own geographical locations, seeing the characters as characters around oneself, recognizing someone next to you as similar to someone in the text because you are in search of elements that emphasize a resonant theme. And you know, this is very interesting work done. It's placing him more and more as a kind of, you know, a playwright whom you can dig into for historical knowledge. But what is very interesting about it, and I'm going to close here. Example, you know, when Brexit came about, a person, you know, called which I think came out this May, 2020 May. I'm not sure about the name because I'm using my memory, but you know, she gave a very interesting study and said, you know, what relevance does Shakespeare about Brexit? can we take some of his sections as being about Brexit? Or can we look at someone who's writing in the past in India as speaking about our present political, economic, social, psychological? This question was asked, this question is being asked, and that's what it means to have a presentist reading of the situation. Now, I told you, when we speak about novels regarding French Revolution, for example, the writers, they are the learned people were the aristocrats, and they usually wrote the novels, like the one I told you, Scarlet Pimpernel, which was by a Baroness Orczy. And so naturally, she doesn't dwell so much on the plight of the poor people and the need for evolution, but instead her hero is an aristocrat. Now, it is to avoid this kind of pitfall of looking at history and looking at history as something where everyone has a voice who lived in that time, and every place has a voice, and every space has a voice, that new readings like the one by Chimamanda Adichie, they come up, where she takes texts that talk about racism, which are not considered literature, but which are more raw fashion, that the general white man believed in white supremacy and believed he had the right to do anything to colored. It's the same. We need to look at biography. We need to look at the text as a separate unit, as in deconstruction. We need to look at it in a presentist view, where we set free our voices, not just those in the books we read, but our voices to find out the relevance of reading history. How it is going to be of help to us as advice for us today, and as warning as to what not to do, and how it helps us to avoid such pitfalls when we plan for the future and to take what is good in it and use it very much. That's my talk.
Okay.
Thank you, Koshi. Anamika?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Koshi, sir, for a very informative session. We have a question answer session right now. I request the moderators to take over the session.
Can I put on the video?
Yes, you can.
Okay, I'll take questions. I hope I did not take too much time. I took only 1 hour.
Right, sir. It's okay, sir.
Thank you, Anamika ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your wonderful session. Sir, I find some questions in the chat box. Shall I read the questions?
Sure.
Okay. So first question is, if one takes this topic for research studies or for paper publication, what is the scope?
I would think that there's tremendous scope for this topic for research and for paper publication, because I have been giving examples of novels that have already been much worked on. But in India, we have so many novels in English and in regional languages. We have films, we have TV serials, and they can be looked at in terms of presentism or historicism, or a mix of a biographical approach, presentism and historicism, or new historicism, and they would yield rich dividends. Lalitambika Andarjanam, she has a novel which Shyama Prasad made into a famous serial, for example, Agnisakshi. You know it, right? I'm sure all of you have heard of it in Kerala. Maybe those who are listening to me who are not from Kerala may not know about it. But there are so many novels that have not really been looked at as historical fiction, have not really been looked at from a presentist viewpoint, have not really been looked at from a viewpoint mixing biography, textual analysis, deconstruction, historical analysis, and presentism or new historicism. And it would yield rich dividends if we study it that way. Chitra Divakarni, Kavita Kane, so many writers are there.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, one more question. Could you discuss how historical fiction differs from historiographic metafiction?
You see, historical fiction, as I told you, is supposed to, although people speak about the Knight's Tale in Chaucer and all as the beginning, but historical fiction is basically something that came about or rose to prominence in the 18th and the 19th centuries. So in a way, it's an outdated form because fiction has moved beyond it. You have so many new genres, hybrid genres. And if you look at, for example, I don't know if you heard of a book called Outlander, which was made into a very successful movie. If you look at books like that, you see that it has moved into spaces that people don't usually go into. Now, historiographic metafiction is, directly counter to what I was speaking of. It was it started as a kind of, you can say, being very postmodern as a joke or parody on what people like Stephen Greenblatt were trying to do. You must understand that when, these people like Greenblatt came up, they were also criticized heavily, and some people said, these people are talking utter rubbish when they speak of historic embeddedness and all that. So what, a historiographic metafiction does is, it says, stop projecting, what you think is what happened then into your reading of what is the book you are reading, historical fiction. And instead, try to understand that for historians, there are facts which are very different from events. Do you understand the difference clearly? So historiographical metafiction, it is actually, it brings in elements where it takes the story, studies the story from the point of view of the writer and the reader, and tries to point out the false assumptions that the reader brings into reading the story as a result of bringing in the baggage from his own present into his reading of the text, where he may go wrong that way. Do you understand? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So one more question.
Yeah.
So one more question. I asked, state of women in historical fiction, particularly in Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. Okay. You know that feminism also came up around the same time that, Dickens was writing his novels. For the first time, there were men writing about, there was a book, very famous book called The Emancipation of Women, but there were also writers just before him like Mary Shelley, and, there women had finally, begun speaking for themselves. I read that quotation from Jane Austen. And, when we come to Tale of Two Cities, Tale of Two Cities is not typical of the usual Dickens novels. But, Sidney Carton is in love with this girl whom he idealizes and whom he is ready to lay down his life for. And finally, he has to lay down his life for her to save her lover because he looks like her lover. So he goes to the guillotine instead of the lover, and the lover escapes, and the woman escapes, and they live happily ever after, and they have a child whom they name after Sidney Carton, who is the hero. So in a way, he comes back to life in the child who is named as a tribute to his noble sacrifice. Now, what about the presence of women? Now, here, I don't think you should take it as representative of Dickens, but in this novel, Dickens idealizes women characters. But if you see a novel like Hard Times, or if you see other women characters in all his novels, you can see that he presents them realistically and yet he speaks for them. So you can speak of him not as a feminist, but as a pre-feminist or a proto-feminist. As someone who takes the side of the women without maybe understanding what women actually want, speaking still for women, which is a problem that we find in the present world. Why people have a problem with Gandhi, because they say he speaks for the Dalits, but we want the Dalits to speak for themselves. And this is the same problem we have with Dickens's presentation of women in a novel like A Tale of Two Cities. On the one hand, he presents this idealized heroine. On the other hand, he presents a woman who's very bloodthirsty, who is from the laboring, toiling masses. And, you feel he is making fun of women, perhaps indirectly, that, if you're poor and you don't have education, you can be bloodthirsty. You don't think at all, about killing and all that. But that's not it. If you read carefully, you understand that that's not the message. The message is that women can turn into such beings because they have been pushed and oppressed long enough by the aristocracy and the monarchy, to the point where they are capable of enacting revenge cold-bloodedly on people they think are above them in station without thinking twice about it. It doesn't matter to them whether they knew that person or did not know that person. They can betray them, they can hand them over to be guillotined. So, I don't think that it's black and white. I don't think, just like about Shakespeare, I mean, when you talk about Caesar, it's not that, you can say he's speaking against Caesar. Some people say he's speaking for Caesar through Mark Antony. But he is, that's his greatness, his universality, that we don't know whether he's speaking for Caesar or against Caesar. In the same way, Dickens is also called the Shakespeare of the English novel and the master of English prose. And, his portrayal of women is complex, and we can't reduce it to a one-dimensional frame and say, he's, unknowingly or knowingly, unconsciously or consciously betraying, women, although he is trying to speak for them. No, nothing of the sort. You can have different positions on it.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So one more question.
Yeah.
The question is, can we say that retelling have similar features of historical fiction?
I mean, not at the surface level. If you retell a story, you try to change very few things, and you try to keep the body of it intact. If I tell the story of Nangeli, for example, I don't want to change the story because I want to keep the central idea intact. That women were oppressed, that there was caste oppression, and they were taxed, and they could not wear an upper covering. I don't want to change this. So, a retelling, now again, I have to come back to new historicism, and retelling will change some things. A retelling will definitely bring in elements of fiction. It will retain elements of history, but a retelling tries to be true to the source it draws upon. So Shakespeare's retellings, for example, are very different from what is commonly called retelling, which is, I believe, the way in which you are using the term. Because Shakespeare doesn't retell, he recreates. He does what he likes with the original source. But retelling is not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be essentially true, although the word essence can be questioned in theory. Essentially true, not in the term of truth, but true to the source it is drawing upon.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
We have a question from
Yeah.
viewers in YouTube. May I?
Okay. Sure.
With literary theories like new criticism and deconstruction, in which the authorial is intention and history of the writer is considered of no value, what relevance does history still hold? Shall I repeat the question, sir?
No need to repeat.
Okay, thank you, sir.
You know, people who think that the world of has in it new criticism or deconstruction can think the past has no relevance. The author's intention or voice has no relevance. But if you know the number of literary theories there are, critical theories, literary philosophies, and that they are expanding and daily they are increasing, and if you know that the latest theories are things like disability studies, children's rights, animal rights, eco-criticism and its hybrids, if you know about ethnic studies, if you know about the latest forms of cultural studies, the question becomes irrelevant because all these are, they draw their roots back not only to postmodernism, deconstruction, and practical criticism and new criticism and close textual analysis, and not only to sources like essays like The Death of the Author or What is an Author by Foucault, or by Roland Barthes, but it also, times have changed. This is 2020. That question comes from somebody who may be living in 1990.
Oh, okay. Thank
And
you.
now history has never been as relevant as before, and the past has never been as relevant as before. Every day we are forced to re-examine our connection to the past and to history, and it is no longer a shame, except in some places, maybe, I don't know, which are very heavily into postmodernism and deconstruction and post-structuralism, and only that. Maybe for them, things like asking, what about the author's biography? What about the author's voice? What about the author's style? What about the author's intention? Maybe they think all this is irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant in the larger realm of what we are speaking of as theory now. And each of these new theories I spoke to you about, embodiment in trauma, or disability studies, or ethnic studies, or the new forms of cultural studies, or presentism, that in all these things history is very relevant. How do you talk about trauma without talking about the history of the individual and the history of the group or community he is embodied in? How do you talk of disability studies if you don't talk about the history of disability rights? How do you talk about ethnic studies or Dalit studies if you don't bring in history? So, the question is irrelevant for me.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Neelu ma'am, is that it? Or are there other questions?
Yes, there are no other questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Finally, I invite Sarah Paul to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Anamika. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this solemn occasion. First of all, I'd like to thank God Almighty for the success of this webinar. On behalf of the Department of English, Mother Teresa College, I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Koshi, Assistant Professor and Head of the Teaching and Learning Unit, Department of English, Jezzan University, Saudi Arabia, for taking us along the interesting, informative, and illuminative path of his presentation titled, The Relevance of Historical Fiction in the Contemporary Times. Koshi sir's proposal offers fresh and relevant perspectives on the frequent, substantial, and ongoing overlaps between history and fiction. Thank you, sir, for the erudite and insightful talk. I extend my profound gratitude to our dear management for permitting us to conduct this international webinar. My wholehearted thanks to our esteemed principal, Dr. K.M. Francis, for his generous and ready help that he always renders. Thank you, sir. I'm also indebted to Professor M.P. Joseph, Head of the Department of English, for his guidance and support. I express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Viraj, Head of the History Department, who initiated in organizing this international webinar and for constantly motivating us. A big thank you to you, sir. Sincere thanks to Mr. Gokul P. Coordinator, IQAC, also the Assistant Professor of Malayalam and Mass Communication, and his team for providing us with all support in this event, for this event. I also thank Assistant Professors Ms. Neelu Prasitha, Mrs. Asha Jacob, Ms. Anamika Srini of the English Department, who were the moderators and hosts of today's session. Thanking all my colleagues of the MTC family, and I'm sure that without their help and support, this webinar wouldn't have been possible. Finally, a big thank you, dear participants, faculty, academicians, research scholars, and students from various universities from all over India and abroad for your overwhelming response and cooperation. Thank you. Stay safe and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We are winding up the webinar. Before closing, let me please inform you that we will be playing the Indian National Anthem towards the end of the webinar, and I request all participants to pay tribute to the National Anthem. Before closing, I thank all of you once again who have joined in this webinar. Hope to see you in yet another webinar. Stay safe. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.